Apple found, a company which was actually populated by former Apple people that made a product called Sound. And in a few months, they transformed that program into something that looked like a Mac program, and that was called iTunes.
In January 2001, Steve Jobs takes the stage at the Macworld Expo in San Francisco to announce iTunes, Apple's jukebox software and first step into the digital music space.
Steve Jobs' keynote presentation is like a Rolling Stones show.
Thank you all for coming.
You may have seen a lot over the years, but you never want to miss one. In the year 2001, he came to Macworld and brought iTunes, which was the first Macintosh jukebox. This was something that really pushed the limits of what a jukebox could do. It was more beautiful, it was easier to use than anything, either on the Macintosh certainly, but also in the Windows world. And you knew right then that Apple was deep in the game in digital music.
To us, at its core, it's all about the music.
For Steve, music was the natural thing. It was the perfect synthesis for Apple because Steve understood that music was part of our DNA. I mean, computer, let's be honest, it's sort of a 20th century thing. Typing on a keyboard and looking at a screen, and it's not an intuitive, primal thing. Music is a primal thing. It's something that's been with human beings since drums in the jungle. So, this was something where if he could pull it off right, he could take the digital world, marry it to that primal thing, and make something really important.
It would be that very idea that would soon change Apple forever.
And towards the end, the meetings went from weekly to daily, and he became very, very involved.
Steve used to give a lot of feedback on the audio. He has a very gifted knack for detecting harmonics. He could tell you right away if it sounds good, if it doesn't sound good. He would give reports back to us that the buttons weren't clicking fast enough, or you couldn't get to the song you wanted in less than 3 clicks.
If you know a Steve Jobs product, you know that he likes simplicity. The very first Macintosh, for instance, had no cursor keys, even though every computer should have cursor keys. Similarly, he didn't want an off switch on the iPod. He wanted the fewest switches possible.
Especially in the polishing and the design, the aesthetics, the use, the interface. His personality is all over that, and it was that typical Steve Jobs insistence on the best experience.
But with just 3 months to go before launch, the iPod development hits a snag.
Towards the end of the development cycle, they were setting up the factories to make the thing, and they discovered that they had a problem with the power management.
About 3 months before the end of the project, we find out that the iPod is going dead after about 3 hours, even when it's turned off. And that battery life just isn't acceptable. The mood around the office was that we either fixed it or we might as well go home.
For 8 stressful weeks, the engineers scrambled to fix the problem, and finally it's solved. After months of around-the-clock work, the iPod is ready. Steve sends an email to the press, inviting them to come to the launch of a new Apple product. Teasing them, it simply reads, hint, it's not a Mac. On October 23, 2001, Steve takes the stage to unveil his latest creation.
The iPod introduction was another great moment of Steve. He shows up and he says, I've got this new thing I'm going to show you today, but I'm not going to bring it out right yet. And he kind of wanders around the stage and he whets the appetite, and then he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the iPod.
There it is, right there.
He says, this is the first day in a whole new revolution.
This amazing little device holds 1,000 songs, and it goes right in my pocket.
The place was filled with journalists who all looked at this and were going, what is this? Nobody really knew what he was up to.
No one was really expecting them to come out with an MP3 player.
It is now accessible to everybody to have 1,000 songs and find them and navigate them faster.
They basically just made it an incredibly easy to grasp proposition for most people.
When the iPod came out, Bill Gates was in New York City and was having a dinner for a few journalists, and I had just gotten my iPod, and I decided to bring it to that dinner. Bill Gates had not seen the iPod, and before I left, I showed it to Bill, and his eyes went like saucers, and he immediately started playing with it and taking it in, and he looked at me and he said, "This is only for Macintosh?"
Steve had succeeded in creating the iPod, but it would take a stroke of pure luck to help turn it into a worldwide phenomenon. With the launch of the iPod in October 2001, the timing could not have been worse to kick off a new product.
Well, the iPod was launched at the least auspicious time. Napster had just been sued and had lost. Everyone who had been sharing MP3 files was shell-shocked. Second of all, 9/11 had happened a month before. The country was shell-shocked. The dot-com meltdown had started earlier in the year, and the Silicon Valley economy was falling apart. There was very little reason to be excited about any kind of new product.
It was a little bit early in the market, and so no one was really sure how this digital music thing was going to play out. And so it seemed like Apple was making a pretty risky move into what was so far a pretty unproven market.
When the iPod first came out, a lot of people were very skeptical about it. It was quite expensive. It was $400. It was Mac only. People said the iPod stood for idiots price our devices, or I prefer owning discs, in reference to CD players.
Despite the early criticism, the iPod did have a few things working in its favor.
There are a few different things that made the iPod really stand apart from the rest of the crowd. One is that it's excellent integration with iTunes. What Apple was able to achieve was a level of seamless integration with the software that almost no one else has been able to do.
The iPod, when it came out, was already not the best music player. That is, it wasn't the most capacious, it wasn't the least expensive. But what it was a fashion statement. It was a piece of jewelry. It was so beautiful.
You know, it's one thing to have a bunch of songs on a device, but it's useless unless you can find what you're looking for. The competition did allow you to search by artist and album, but what it didn't do, once you got to a song list, you'd be clicking, click, click, all the way through, and when you have 5,000 songs on there or more, it's just not going to work. With the iPod, you'd start scrolling, you'd be like, and then it speeds up. It's like, all the way through. And you're like, whoa, that was just mind-blowing.
But most importantly, the iPod had a band of Mac loyalists hungry to embrace it.
Well, Apple started with an advantage which almost no other brand has, which is an incredibly loyal cult base of users. So when the iPod came out, it was grasped with enthusiasm by that group. It was a fantastic reason to evangelize the brand to their friends, to anyone else who would listen.
So sometimes tech products stay in tech and never make it out of the geek world. If a product has sparked the interest of fashion, of car culture, of music, of, sports, I mean, we're in so many areas of culture that now there's great momentum and an avalanche of interest starting with all the right people, and that's what happened with the iPod.
In its first 2 months on sale, the iPod lands in the hands and ears of 125,000 of the world's biggest trendsetters. But it would be a stroke of pure luck that made everyone else take notice.